Hello, welcome to Chat UTD, and on the day of his funeral it seems like an opportune time to pay tribute to the great Denis Law, who passed away last month. Denis was long retired when I was born, so I never saw him playing in real life, but as a student of United and being lucky enough to have my dad, my uncle, my dad's friends regale me with tales of Best Law and Charlton, I feel like I have a good handle of that era and a good knowledge of that era. I also, as a kid, had VHS videos of the best games of the 60s, best games of the 70s, best United games of the 60s and 70s. I wasn't really interested in other teams. And Law featured prominently in that. So the tribute I'm going to give is from my own knowledge, and albeit that I wasn't there firsthand to experience it. A common feature of those videos was that Denis always looked absolutely soaking wet. Always looked like a kid on the playground that was a bit like that, like, oh, how long is this game going to go on for? And his sleeves were always a bit too long for him, and he had his cuff like that, and sort of looked like a wiry 5'9" waif that you think, well, what damage is he going to do? And then you see his record and you see him play, and he was like a whippet, and how good he was in the air for such a small framed player, both in terms of height and width, really. And you think, wow, what a special player, in particular in an era that was really more suited to defenders than it was to attackers, with mud-sodden pitches and referees who would take a liberal eye on some of the tackling that was going on, if we can call it tackling. It was out and out assault at times. My impression of Law, particularly in relation to his two United Trinity counterparts, was that perhaps he had that little bit of cult status amongst the United fans. Perhaps he had that little bit of devilment about him. And I would never pit any of those three against each other, and that's not what I'm doing. But I think with Best and Charlton, it always seemed to me that they were quite, on the pitch at least, they were quite refined and polished and just like silk. Whereas I say, Denis was this mud-sodden waif that would get in people's faces, would cause a bit of a ruck if he needed to, certainly wasn't shy about putting his foot in, and had that natural nastiness that you need, especially in that era, to play up front. He was a scorer of a vast amount of goals, but also different types of goals. As I said, for his frame, he was so good in the air. He would hang in the air like a salmon. And even just his simple goal celebration, which was just one arm in the air, became really iconic. I don't know if he meant it to, but it did. Thinking about just some statistics, if you like, or some more detail about his career, he broke the transfer record 3 times in going from Huddersfield to City, then City to Torino, then Torino to United. As I say, he went to Torino in that era, 1961 to 62. That was really rare that a British player would go and play abroad. It's still pretty rare now, but it was even more rare then. It's probably not quite as rare for players to play for City and United, but he played for City twice in 2 very brief spells, and obviously an 11-year career at United, and really was loved wherever he went. And I think to cross that divide and still be revered by both sets of fans now is says something about the player. And he only had those 2 brief spells at City, as I say. Mind you, let's face it, they don't have many legends to cling on to, do they? So they probably trying to take one of ours, but he's very much our legend. 11 years at United and a fantastic career. Won the FA Cup in 1963 in his first season. Won the Ballon d'Or in 1964. Won league titles in 65 and 67. Was injured for the European Cup final, unfortunately, but played a big part in us getting there. And if memory serves, again, just from grainy videos that I've seen, was part of the ruck that went off when we played Estudiantes in 1969 in the World Club Cup, as it would, the version of that then, when they had some underhand dirty tricks and Denis wasn't having any of it. So a real character. My uncle's favourite player. My uncle said when Dennis died, he sent me a message saying that George Best is the greatest player he ever saw, but my favourite is Denis Law, and it always has been, always will be. Which I was really touched by. You know, my uncle's 75 years old. He stood on the Stretford End in the 60s. I think he spent quite a bit of time there with my dad. And he took my auntie, and it's just lovely to think of Dennis to my uncle is what Cantona and Keane is to me, and I know how special those people are to me. And right now, luckily, the heroes of my era are all still fit and well and still relatively young. But I think that connection to the past, the further distant past, like the 50s and 60s, is a massive part of Man United and really important. And I think for those older fans who are still here and still watch United, I think that connection is really important. And I think I felt emotional for my uncle that one of his heroes had passed away, but also emotional that it's another connection to the glorious past of United that that we need to hang on to, because it's part of the folklore of the club. And I think for me, when I was growing up watching those grainy videos, for me, I was growing up in the 80s, and I was watching the videos of the 70s and 60s, and I started going to United with my dad. We were rubbish as a team, but I think part of the attraction and part of the romanticism of United was the myth and the mystique of Law, Best and Charlton. And when I went to Old Trafford, I think I've said this before on here, I felt that connection to the standing on the shoulder of giants, to the Munich team, to the Busby Babes, to Law, Best, Charlton, Bill Fowkes, Harry Gregg, and even to some degree the teams of the 70s that were you know, the flying swashbuckling teams with Gordon Hill and Steve Coppell and Martin Buchan. I always kind of felt that connection, that's part of what I'm watching now is that. And I said to my my lad, who's a striker, who actually in frame doesn't look that dissimilar to Denis Law, and he's quite a prolific goal scorer actually. Obviously I'm biased, but the record doesn't lie. On the weekend, I think Dennis died on the Friday, so it was a Saturday morning, and I was telling him about Denis Law, and I said to him, if you score today, just get your, he wears his sleeves long, and I said, just get your cuff and go like that. That was his celebration. Unfortunately, typically he didn't score that weekend. But I think it's really important to kind of keep that story going, keep passing that on, because with a club now, and I'm not going to get into it because it's not appropriate, but with a club now that's unrecognisable from the club that I want it to be, and those connections are so important to Best, Law, Charlton, and these are pivotal key figures to our football club. And yeah, you know, he was 84 years old, he had Alzheimer's, he wasn't in good health. He's led a long and hopefully happy life, but it's bigger than that in terms of, as a United fan, that we have to hold dear those heroes that blazed the trail for what was before them. Just a few more observations, and again, this was probably more as I was growing up. He did some TV work, and I remember when United won their first title in 92-93, we won the league by virtue of Oldham beating Aston Villa on the Sunday, which meant Villa couldn't catch us anymore, who were in second place. And on the Monday evening, we were playing Blackburn, and we were already champions. And I've still got it somewhere on VHS, I taped it, old school. The coverage from Sky started quite early, and the colour and the noise and the scenes around the ground was just magical. And I remember thinking even then, this is an acknowledgement that we're the champions of 1993, absolutely. But it's also a tip of the hat to the history of our club that we now are seeing these images again of 1967, because that's the last time we won it, and embracing that as well. And it was so fitting that evening, if I remember rightly, I know Sir Matt Busby and his wife were there, because I can see it now in my mind's eye, them singing along to Glory, Glory Man United. But I'm pretty sure George Best, Denis Law were interviewed. Maybe it wasn't for Sky, maybe it was part of something different. But I remember Denis Law and George Best, and I think Charlton was probably there, probably Charlton was there as well. There was no begrudging this next generation. There was no resentment or bitterness that they were no longer the only immortals associated with Manchester United. It was a very natural handing over of the baton, and just delighted for the club that they'd represented for so long. And as I said, when you play for Man United, you're standing on the shoulder of giants. And God, if and when we ever win the league now, I don't think that'll ever happen anytime soon. It will be, Gary Neville, Roy Keane, and players like that who will be the ones, hopefully, at Old Trafford handing over the baton. But I think that link to the past is really, really important. Always struck me as having a very dry sense of humour, mischief. Like, his name suited him in terms of Denis the Menace. Like, always looked like he kind of had a little bit of a joke in his mind that he wasn't sharing with everybody else, which I like that devilment that people have in them. But as I say, as a player, just quite rightly revered by generations of Reds, and his goal scoring record is only behind Wayne Rooney and Bobby Charlton. He's the third top scorer for Man United. I think for a long time he held the record in Europe as United's record scorer in Europe. I think Rude might have taken it. And do you know what, just finally, what always sticks in my mind about Denis Law is when he backheeled the goal for Man City in 1974, which wrongly is said to have relegated United, it didn't. But when he scored that goal, and I think he realised the gravity of what was happening, as in his beloved United were getting relegated, his reaction to it is quite emotional, really, in that he just walks away as if to go, what have I just done? And the City players go and mob him, and he's just like, he's bewildered. He's in a world of his own. He's not there. And rumour has it that he went in the dressing room and just didn't say anything, was just quiet, and he retired. I think he'd intended to go into the 74-75 season, but didn't, just retired. So much did United mean to him. And the feeling's mutual, because he's loved and revered by United fans all around the world. And that connection to the past is really, really important. And I'll carry on telling my kids stories about that, because what they see right now isn't Manchester United. Manchester United is Denis Law, is George Best, is Bobby Charlton, and many heroes that have gone since. So God bless you, Denis, and I hope he gets a really good send-off today. Glazers out.